On a cold evening in Chicago, sometime in the late 1950s, the streets of the near West Side moved with a familiar rhythm. Neon signs flickered above corner taverns. The sound of distant traffic echoed between brick buildings. Men in long coats walked with purpose, their conversations low, their eyes watchful. It was a city that never truly slept and never truly spoke openly about the forces that controlled it. Inside a modest restaurant, far from the noise of downtown, a man sat quietly at a corner table. He did not look like a king. There were no bodyguards hovering over his shoulder, no loud displays of power, no expensive jewelry catching the light. Just a calm, composed figure, eating his dinner in silence. But in that moment, without raising his voice, without even drawing attention, he held influence over one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. His name was Tony Accardo, and unlike the gangsters Hollywood made famous, his story was never meant to be seen. Because Tony Accardo did not build his empire through spectacle. He built it through silence. And that silence made him far more dangerous than the men who came before him. But to understand how he became the most powerful unseen force in the Chicago outfit, you have to go back to the beginning. Long before the power, before the wealth, before the carefully constructed image of a quiet businessman, there was a boy growing up in the streets of Chicago. Anthony Joseph Accardo was born on April 28, 1906, in Chicago, Illinois. His parents were Italian immigrants, part of a wave of families seeking opportunity in a rapidly expanding American city. But opportunity was not equally distributed. In the early 1900s, Chicago was a city divided. Neighborhoods were controlled not just by culture, but by power. And in many of these neighborhoods, power did not come from politics or law enforcement. It came from the streets. Accardo grew up in an environment where survival depended on understanding that reality. School held little interest for him. By his early teens, he had already begun drifting away from formal education. The structure of classrooms could not compete with what he saw outside, where influence was immediate, visible, and often rewarded. By the time he was a teenager, Accardo had already begun associating with local street gangs. It started small: petty thefts, minor jobs, running errands for older figures who operated in the shadows. But even then, there was something different about him. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't loud. He watched. He learned. And more importantly, he understood patience. That trait would define everything that came next. In the early 1920s, Chicago was entering one of the most turbulent periods in its history. Prohibition had taken effect. Alcohol was illegal. Demand was not. And in that gap, an entire underground economy was born. Bootlegging operations expanded rapidly. Criminal organizations grew stronger. And violence became a tool not just for survival, but for dominance. At the center of it all was a man whose name would become legendary: Al Capone. Capone's rise transformed Chicago into the epicenter of organized crime in America. His organization controlled vast networks of alcohol distribution, gambling, and protection rackets. And for young men like Accardo, it presented an opportunity. But entry into that world was not easy. You had to prove yourself, and proof often came through violence. Accardo earned his place the way many did during that era, through his willingness to do what others would not. By the mid-1920s, he had become associated with Capone's organization, not as a leader, not even as a recognized figure, but as something far more essential: an enforcer. He became known for carrying out assignments with precision. No unnecessary noise, no mistakes, no hesitation. And in a world where failure often meant death, that reputation mattered. Stories began to circulate. One of the most infamous involved the use of a baseball bat, a brutal method of execution that would later become part of Chicago's criminal mythology. Whether exaggerated or not, the story served a purpose. It created an image. And in organized crime, image was everything. But what set Accardo apart was not the violence. It was what came after. While others sought recognition, he avoided it. While others built reputations through fear, he built trust through reliability. And that distinction would eventually bring him closer to the inner circle. As the 1920s progressed, the Chicago outfit became more structured. It was no longer just a loose network of criminals. It was an organization with hierarchy, strategy, and long-term vision. And within that structure, certain individuals began to stand out. Accardo was one of them. He worked under key figures in Capone's organization, learning not just how to enforce orders, but how those orders were made. He observed how money flowed, how alliances were formed, how power was maintained, and perhaps most importantly, how it could be lost. Because despite Capone's dominance, the pressure from law enforcement was increasing. The federal government began to take a more aggressive approach. Investigations intensified, surveillance expanded, and eventually, even someone as powerful as Capone could not escape it. In 1931, Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion. It was a turning point, not just for Capone, but for the entire structure of organized crime in Chicago. Because when a leader falls, the question is never just what happens to him. The real question is, who rises next? And in the aftermath of Capone's conviction, a quieter, more strategic leadership began to emerge. One that understood something Capone did not fully embrace. Visibility was a liability. And this is where Tony Accardo's path began to change. He was no longer just an enforcer. He had proven loyalty, proven competence, proven discretion, and those qualities were far more valuable in a new era of organized crime, one that required subtlety instead of spectacle. Under the leadership of Frank Nitti and later Paul Ricca, the Chicago outfit began to shift its approach. Less public violence, more calculated operations, expansion into new industries. And behind the scenes, individuals like Accardo became increasingly important. He was trusted, and in that world, trust was everything. By the late 1930s, Accardo had moved further up within the organization. He was no longer simply carrying out orders. He was involved in decisions, coordinating activities, managing operations, building connections, and unlike many of his contemporaries, he avoided the mistakes that often led to downfall. He did not seek attention. He did not attract unnecessary scrutiny. He stayed invisible. But invisibility did not mean weakness. It meant control. Because while others were being watched, investigated, and eventually arrested, Accardo remained untouched. And that would become his greatest strength. As the outfit expanded beyond bootlegging into gambling, labor racketeering, and other ventures, Accardo's role continued to grow. He understood business. He understood structure. And he understood that power was not about being seen at the top. It was about controlling everything beneath it. Within a few years, the empire began to evolve. And so did Tony Accardo. But the story didn't end there. Because as the 1940s approached, the Chicago outfit was no longer just surviving. It was adapting. And in that adaptation, a new kind of leader was quietly taking shape. One who would eventually control the entire organization, without ever needing to announce it. And the decisions made during this period would change everything. In the early 1940s, Chicago had changed. The chaos of Prohibition had faded into memory, replaced by something far more controlled and far more dangerous. The violence was still there. The corruption remained deeply rooted. But now, it operated with precision. Less noise, more structure. And behind that structure, the Chicago outfit was stronger than ever. On the surface, it appeared as though new leadership had taken control. Frank Nitti had stepped in after Al Capone's imprisonment, followed by Paul Ricca, a man known for his strategic thinking and quiet authority. Together, they reshaped the outfit into a modern criminal enterprise, less visible, more disciplined, and far more profitable. But within that evolving structure, one figure was becoming increasingly central. Tony Accardo. He did not hold press conferences. He did not command attention. But inside the organization, his influence was growing in ways that few outside could see. And that was exactly how he wanted it. By the mid-1940s, the outfit had moved far beyond bootlegging. Its operations now extended into labor unions, gambling syndicates, loan sharking, and infiltration of legitimate businesses. Entire industries were quietly influenced, sometimes controlled, through networks that stretched across cities. And Accardo was at the center of it. Not as a public boss, but as a coordinator, a stabilizer, a man who ensured that everything functioned without disruption. One of the most significant expansions during this period came through control of labor unions. In cities like Chicago, unions held enormous power. They controlled access to jobs, influenced wages, and had leverage over major industries. The outfit understood this, and they moved carefully. Through intimidation, bribery, and strategic placement of loyal individuals, they began to insert themselves into union leadership. From there, they could influence construction contracts, transportation networks, and manufacturing operations. Money began to flow in ways that were almost impossible to track. And with that money came influence. But Accardo's approach was different from those who came before him. He did not rely on constant violence. He used it sparingly, because he understood something critical. Fear could establish power, but stability sustained it. Throughout the late 1940s, Accardo worked closely with Paul Ricca, forming a partnership that would define the future of the Chicago outfit. Ricca handled high-level strategy. Accardo handled execution. It was a balance that worked. And as long as that balance remained intact, the organization thrived. But outside their world, pressure was building. Law enforcement agencies were becoming more organized. Federal investigations were expanding, and public attention toward organized crime was growing. The government was beginning to understand that these were not isolated gangs. They were networks, and those networks had leaders. In 1943, that pressure reached a breaking point. Paul Ricca, along with several other outfit leaders, was indicted for involvement in a scheme that extended all the way to Hollywood. The case involved control over the film industry's labor unions, specifically efforts to extort movie studios by threatening strikes and production shutdowns. It was a bold operation, and it attracted attention at the highest levels. Ricca was eventually convicted and sentenced to prison. And with that, a critical question emerged. Who would take control? The answer was not announced. There was no public declaration, no shift in visible leadership. But within the organization, the transition was clear. Tony Accardo stepped forward, not as a loud, visible boss, but as something far more effective, a man who would run the outfit from the shadows. Under Accardo's leadership, the organization entered one of its most stable and profitable periods. He maintained a structure Ricca had helped build, but refined it. Operations were streamlined, communication became more controlled, and perhaps most importantly, exposure was minimized. Accardo avoided unnecessary meetings. He limited his public appearances. He did not allow himself to become the kind of figure that law enforcement could easily target. Instead, he delegated. Capos handled daily operations. Trusted associates managed specific rackets, and Accardo remained just out of reach. This structure allowed the outfit to expand beyond Chicago. By the 1950s, its influence stretched across the country. Las Vegas became a key focus. Casinos offered an opportunity that aligned perfectly with the outfit's model. Large amounts of cash, limited oversight, and the ability to skim profits before they were officially recorded. Through a network of partnerships and investments, the Chicago outfit established a presence in several Las Vegas casinos. Money flowed from Nevada back to Chicago, quietly, consistently, and in massive amounts. Accardo oversaw this expansion with the same discipline he applied to everything else. No unnecessary attention, no reckless moves. Every operation calculated, every risk considered. But even in this controlled environment, challenges emerged. Rival organizations watched closely. Internal conflicts occasionally surfaced, and law enforcement pressure never fully disappeared. The 1950s also brought a new kind of threat: public exposure. In 1950 and 1951, the U.S. Senate held hearings on organized crime, led by Senator Estes Kefauver. For the first time, Americans were given a detailed look into the structure and reach of criminal organizations. Names were mentioned, operations were discussed, and the idea of a nationwide crime syndicate entered the public consciousness. Although Accardo avoided direct involvement in these hearings, the impact was undeniable. The spotlight had shifted, and in that spotlight, mistakes could be fatal. But Accardo did not panic. He adapted. He further reduced visibility. He reinforced discipline within the organization, and he ensured that those beneath him understood the importance of staying out of public view. That decision would prove critical, because as other crime figures were exposed, investigated, and prosecuted, Accardo remained largely untouched. It was not luck. It was strategy. He had built an organization that could function without drawing attention to its leader, and in doing so, he made himself almost invisible. But invisibility did not mean inactivity. Behind the scenes, the outfit continued to expand. Gambling operations grew. Loan sharking networks extended into new territories. Legitimate businesses were used to launder money and create additional revenue streams. The empire was no longer confined to one city. It was national, and at its center was a man who rarely appeared in headlines. But the story didn't end there, because power, no matter how carefully managed, always attracts pressure. And by the early 1960s, that pressure began to shift again. Federal agencies became more aggressive. New laws were introduced. Surveillance techniques improved. And for the first time, even someone as careful as Tony Accardo could not completely avoid attention. The system he had built was strong, but it was not invincible. And as the years passed, cracks would begin to appear. Because in the world of organized crime, control is never permanent. And the same strategy that protected Accardo for decades would soon be tested in ways he could not fully control. That test would define the final chapter of his life. In the early 1960s, the landscape of organized crime in America began to shift once again. The old rules still applied: loyalty, silence, control. But the world outside was changing faster than ever before. Law enforcement was no longer reacting. It was evolving. New federal strategies were being developed. Intelligence sharing between agencies improved. Surveillance techniques became more advanced. And perhaps most importantly, prosecutors were beginning to understand how to dismantle entire organizations, not just individual criminals. For decades, Tony Accardo had operated in a space that few could reach. He had avoided headlines, avoided flashy displays of power, avoided the kinds of mistakes that had brought down men like Al Capone. But now, even that careful strategy was being tested, because the government had learned something critical. The quiet ones were often the most powerful, and they were no longer willing to ignore them. On a quiet morning in Chicago, federal agents arrived at Accardo's home. It was not the first time law enforcement had taken interest in him, but this time felt different, more deliberate, more focused. Search warrants were executed, properties were examined, financial records were scrutinized. They were looking for something, anything that could connect him directly to the operations he controlled so carefully from a distance. But as they moved through his home, they encountered the same problem investigators had faced for years. There was no obvious evidence, no direct links, no clear trail leading back to the empire everyone believed he controlled. Accardo had spent decades building that separation, and now it was protecting him. But the pressure did not disappear. Throughout the 1960s, federal authorities increased their efforts against organized crime. The introduction of new legal tools allowed prosecutors to pursue broader cases. Surveillance became more precise. Informants began to play a larger role. And slowly, the walls around organizations like the Chicago outfit began to close in. Yet Accardo remained just beyond reach. He adjusted his methods again. Even less visibility, even more delegation. He reduced direct involvement in day-to-day operations, allowing trusted figures to handle activities while he maintained overall influence. It was not a retreat. It was an evolution, because Accardo understood something many did not. Power was not about constant control. It was about maintaining influence, even when you were not seen. By the late 1960s, a new generation of leaders had begun to emerge within the outfit. Men who had grown up under the structure Accardo helped build. Men who understood the rules, but did not always follow them with the same discipline. And that created a new kind of challenge. Internal instability. The organization was still strong, still profitable, still deeply embedded in legitimate and illegitimate industries. But it was no longer as tightly controlled as it had been in earlier decades. And that lack of control created risk. Because in organized crime, risk does not remain isolated. It spreads. In the early 1970s, that risk became visible. Younger figures began to draw attention. Operations became less discreet, and law enforcement, now equipped with better tools and more aggressive strategies, began to make progress. Cases were built, arrests were made, and for the first time in decades, the idea that the Chicago outfit could be weakened became real. But even then, Tony Accardo remained untouched. He was questioned, investigated, called before grand juries, but never convicted, never directly tied to the crimes that defined his organization. It was a level of insulation that few, if any, crime figures had ever achieved. And it was not accidental. It was the result of decades of discipline, careful decision-making, and an understanding that survival required more than power. It required patience. But time has a way of changing everything. By the late 1970s, the world that Accardo had once dominated was no longer the same. The old structures were weakening. Federal laws like the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, gave prosecutors unprecedented ability to target entire criminal networks. And they used it aggressively. Associates were pressured, alliances were tested, and slowly, the organization that had once operated with near total control began to feel the weight of constant scrutiny. Accardo, now older, adapted once more. He stepped even further back. Public appearances became rare. Decisions were made quietly, often through intermediaries. He was no longer the active force he had once been, but his presence still mattered, because within the outfit, his reputation carried weight. He was not just a former leader. He was a symbol, a reminder of a time when the organization operated with precision and discipline. And for many, that memory was enough to maintain a level of order. But outside that world, the perception was different. To law enforcement, Accardo represented something frustrating. A man who had been involved in organized crime for decades, yet had avoided the consequences that others faced. A man who had operated at the highest levels, without leaving behind the evidence needed to convict him. It was not just a failure of investigation. It was a reflection of how carefully he had constructed his life. In the early 1980s, Accardo lived a quiet existence. He resided in suburban Chicago, far removed from the streets where his story had begun. To those who did not know his history, he appeared as nothing more than an aging businessman. There were no visible signs of the empire he had once controlled, no public displays of wealth, no dramatic stories, just silence. The same silence that had defined his entire career. But that silence carried weight, because behind it was one of the most successful criminal careers in American history. Tony Accardo died on May 22, 1992. He was 86 years old. There was no dramatic downfall, no final arrest, no courtroom confession. He did not die in prison. He did not die in hiding. He died quietly, much like he had lived. And that, perhaps, is what makes his story so unusual. Because in a world defined by violence, betrayal, and sudden endings, he endured, for decades, through multiple generations of leadership, through shifting laws and increasing pressure, through the rise and fall of men far more visible than him. He remained, not because he was the most feared, not because he was the most famous, but because he understood something fundamental. The less people saw, the longer you could last. And that philosophy shaped everything he did. His legacy is not one of spectacle. It is not filled with dramatic shootouts or public displays of power. Instead, it is defined by control, discipline, and an almost complete absence of exposure. To this day, Tony Accardo is often overlooked in discussions of organized crime. His name does not carry the same immediate recognition as figures like Al Capone. There are fewer movies, fewer stories, fewer myths. But within the world he inhabited, his influence was undeniable. He helped transform the Chicago outfit from a violent Prohibition-era gang into a structured, enduring criminal enterprise. He guided it through decades of change, and he did so without ever stepping fully into the light. But the story doesn't end with his death, because the system he helped build continued. The networks, the strategies, the approach to power, they remained, and in many ways, they influenced how organized crime operated in the years that followed. More cautious, more controlled, more aware of the dangers of visibility. Tony Accardo did not just survive the world of organized crime. He reshaped it, quietly, carefully, and almost invisibly. And perhaps it is why his story is rarely told, because it does not fit the image people expect. There are no dramatic finales, no public confessions, no single moment where everything collapses. Instead, there is something far more unsettling. A man who controlled an empire and walked away from it without ever truly being seen. And in the end, that may be the most powerful legacy of all.